The wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it the sting of icy rain that burned against the skin like needles. Soraya pulled her thin, torn shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to block the cold. Her small daughter, barely 6 years old, clung to her side, shivering uncontrollably, her lips turning pale under the dim streetlights. They had been walking for hours, going from one closed door to another, hoping someone, anyone, would let them in, but every door was shut. Every voice that answered told her the same thing: go away. No one wanted a widow like her, not in this part of the city, not in any part. Soraya had once lived in a warm home, with food on the table and a husband who protected her, but that was before the war took him away, before his family turned their backs on her. She had nothing left except her daughter, and even that felt like a heavy burden in a world that no longer cared. The alien city was built of steel and glass, with bright signs and tall towers, but down here on the lower levels, life was dark, wet, and cruel. The rain that fell was not water, but a chemical mix from the factories above, eating holes in the fabric of her clothes and leaving her skin raw. Her daughter's small voice broke the silence. "Mama, I'm cold," she whispered, her teeth chattering. Soraya knelt down, wrapping her arms around the child, pressing her close to share what little warmth she had left. "I know, my star," she murmured, "just a little longer, but even." As she said it, she wondered if they could last another hour. Up ahead, the street was darker, lit only by the flicker of a dying lamp. Soraya hesitated. Dark streets meant danger, thieves and worse, but the main road was no better, and the cold was biting deep. She took a deep breath and stepped into the shadows, holding her daughter's hand tight. That was when she heard its sound of heavy boots splashing in the puddles behind her. Her heart began to race. She had learned to fear that sound. Most who walked alone in the dark were predators, not saviors. She pulled her daughter behind a rusted metal crate, hoping the footsteps would pass. The boots stopped. Silence hung in the air, broken only by the patter of the acid rain. Then a voice spoke, deep, calm, and strange. "You'll freeze out here," it said. Soraya turned her head slightly. In the dim light, she saw a tall figure wearing a long, hooded cloak, the fabric thick and lined with a faint glow. She could tell instantly he wasn't from her world. The shape of his face, the broad shoulders, the strange warmth in his eyes. This was a human. Her people whispered stories about humans, that they were dangerous, selfish, and unpredictable. Some said they fought wars for sport. Others claimed they could not be trusted. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The man didn't move closer, but he also didn't leave. "Nothing," he said simply. "Just, you shouldn't be out here with a child." Soraya almost laughed, as if she had a choice. Every shelter, every house, every so-called charity had turned her away. "I have nowhere to go," she said bitterly. "No one wants us." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he extended a hand from beneath his cloak. "Come," he said. "My place is close, warm, dry, and safe." Soraya stared at his hand, her mind racing. This could be a trap. Maybe he wanted something in return. Maybe he was like the others who smiled first but hurt later. But her daughter was trembling so hard now that she could barely stand. Soraya looked at her child, then back at the man. "What's your name?" she asked. "Daniel," he replied, his voice steady. The name meant nothing to her, but something in his tone, a quiet kind of sadness, made her hesitate less. She took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his cloak. Daniel pulled it open just enough for her and her daughter to step under it, and for the first time in days, Soraya felt heat sink into her bones. They walked in silence through the rain. Soraya kept her guard up, scanning every shadow, but Daniel seemed to know the streets well, avoiding the worst alleys and leading them through quieter paths. Finally, they reached a small metal door built into the side of a crumbling warehouse. Daniel tapped a code into the panel, and the door slid open with a hiss. A rush of warm air greeted them. carrying the smell of something cooking. Saraya froze at the threshold, her instincts screaming at her not to enter, but her daughter tugged at her hand, her eyes wide. "Mama, please," she whispered. Saraya swallowed hard and stepped inside. The door closed behind them, shutting out the wind and rain. For the first time in a long while, Saraya wondered if maybe, just maybe, she and her daughter had found a small piece of safety in this cold, merciless city. The warmth inside the small shelter wrapped around Saraya like a blanket. But she didn't let her guard down. Daniel closed the door behind them, then pulled off his hood, his dark hair damp from the rain, his sharp features lit by the dim glow of a heating lamp in the corner. The space was small, just one room, made of metal walls patched with scrap panels. But it was clean, and more importantly, it was warm. A stove hummed in the corner, a pot resting on top, sending out the rich smell of food. Saraya's stomach tightened at the scent, and she realized just how long it had been since she'd eaten a real meal. Her daughter stood frozen near the door, looking around with wide eyes. Daniel noticed and knelt down so he was at her level. "You're safe here," he said softly. "What's your name?" The child glanced at Saraya before answering. "Leary," in a small voice. Daniel smiled faintly, as if the name meant something gentle to him. "Well, Leary, I think you could use something warm to eat," he said, rising and moving to the stove. Saraya stayed near the wall, her back straight, watching every movement he made. She still didn't know why he had brought them here. Kindness from strangers was rare in this city. Rarer still from someone who looked as worn as he did. Her fingers itched to hold the small knife hidden in her clothes. But she didn't move, not yet. Daniel ladled soup into 2 bowls, steam curling up in the air. He set one on the small table for Leary and handed the other to Saraya. The bowl was warm against her chilled fingers, and the smell of the broth was almost overwhelming. She hesitated. If she ate it, it meant she was accepting something from him. And accepting meant owing, but Leary had no such hesitation. The child began eating in quick, hungry mouthfuls, and Saraya's resolve broke. She took a careful sip, and the heat spread through her body like sunlight after a long winter. Daniel sat across from them, eating his own portion in silence, the only sounds in the room were the crackle of the heating unit and the soft clink of spoons. After a while, Saraya spoke, her voice low. "Why?" Daniel glanced up. "Why what?" "Why help me?" she asked. "You don't know me, and I have nothing to give you." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady. "You have a child," he said simply. "That's enough reason." The answer unsettled her. It was too simple, too human. Her people always measured worth in trade, in status, in usefulness. To be helped without offering something back was dangerous. It left you powerless. But the sincerity in his voice made it hard to argue after the meal. Daniel fetched a thick patched blanket from a shelf and handed it to her. "You can rest here tonight," he said. "The rain will get worse before morning." Saraya took it, still unsure if she should trust him. She and Leary curled up in the corner on a thin mat, the blanket wrapping them in much-needed warmth. For the first time in many nights, Leary fell asleep quickly, her breathing soft, and even Saraya did not sleep. Instead, she watched Daniel. He sat near the heating unit, working on a small device with careful hands, the light casting shadows across his face. Every so often, his eyes would drift to a metal box on the shelf, his expression unreadable. Hours later, when he thought she was asleep, he took out a small, worn communicator and spoke into it in a low voice. "I'm still here," he said. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I haven't forgotten." His voice broke slightly, and then he fell silent, staring at the device as if waiting for an answer that never came. Saraya closed her eyes, pretending to sleep when he looked her way. She didn't know who he was speaking to, but she recognized the tone, the voice of someone carrying a loss that never healed. She understood that feeling too well. When morning came, the sound of rain still tapping against the roof, Daniel was already up, pulling out a worn jacket. "I need to go out," he said. "Stay inside, lock the door, and don't open it for anyone but me." He handed her a small metal latch that slid into the door's frame. Soraya frowned. "Where are you going?" "Food," he said shortly, "and medicine." Before she could ask more, he stepped outside, shutting the door. Behind him, hours passed. Soraya tried to rest, but her mind kept replaying his words. Medicine for Leary? For himself? Why risk himself for them? When she peeked through a narrow slit in the wall, she saw him in the market district, moving through the crowd with a cautious but confident step. He stopped at stalls, speaking to rough-looking traders, exchanging goods she didn't recognize. More than once, she saw him refuse offers and walk away, his hand resting near a hidden weapon at his side. By the time he returned, the day's light was fading, and he carried a bag full of food and a small bottle of alien-made healing serum. He set the items down without a word. Soraya looked at him, torn between suspicion and something far more dangerous, the beginnings of trust. She knew kinda no. S could be a weapon, but part of her couldn't help thinking, maybe this was different, and that thought alone scared her more than the cold streets ever had. Asterisk, the rain had stopped by the next morning, leaving the streets outside slick with oily puddles that reflected the pale light of the alien sky. Inside Daniel's small shelter, the air was warmer, filled with the faint scent of herbs from the healing serum he had given to Leary the night before. The child was still asleep, her small hands curled under the blanket, her breathing steady for the first time in days. Soraya sat at the edge of the mat, her eyes fixed on Daniel as he worked quietly near the table. He was cleaning a strange weapon. Not like the blasters she had seen aliens use, but a human-made rifle, worn yet carefully maintained. Every movement of his hands was precise, practiced, like someone who had done this 1,000 times. There was something about the way he moved, calm, controlled, but ready, that told her he had lived through dangerous places before. "You were a soldier," Soraya said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel didn't look up. "Once," he replied simply. She wanted to ask more, but there was a weight in his tone that warned her not to press. Instead, she studied the scar that cut across his jaw, and the faint burn marks on the side of his neck. Scars told stories, and his told of battles far from here. Later that day, Daniel left again, telling her to keep the door locked. Soraya considered his rule, never open for anyone but him. Was it protection? Or control? She wasn't sure. Still, she obeyed, locking the latch as soon as he stepped outside. The hours dragged on. Soraya passed the time by tidying the small room, a habit she had from before her life had fallen apart. She found tools arranged neatly on one shelf, strange human books stacked in another corner, and a few photographs tucked inside a dented metal box. She hesitated before touching them, but curiosity won. The top photo showed Daniel standing with 2 other humans, all wearing the same dark armor, smiling under a foreign sun. The second photo was different. Daniel with a woman and a small boy. The boy sitting on his shoulders, both of them laughing. Soraya felt a strange ache in her chest. These were his people, his past. She wondered where they were now, and why the smile in the photo no longer existed on his face. When Daniel returned, his boots tracked in a thin trail of dirt, and his jacket was damp. He set down a small bundle of supplies without speaking, his eyes scanning the room as if checking for anything out of place. Soraya carefully put the photos back where she had found them, saying nothing, but her mind was buzzing with questions she dared not ask. That night, she pretended to sleep again. Through half-lidded eyes, she saw Daniel sitting near the heating unit, the communicator in his hand. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Command." "It's me," he said. "If anyone's out there, if anyone made it, I'm still alive." There was a long pause, only static answering him. "I couldn't save them," he continued, his tone breaking for the first time. "I tried. I swear I tried." His head lowered, his hands gripping the device tightly, as though holding it could change the past. Saraya's chest tightened. She knew the weight of guilt. It was a constant shadow in her own life. And she recognized the loneliness in his words, the way he was speaking to ghosts that would never answer in the morning. Daniel acted as if nothing had happened. He was quieter, but his movements were the same, cooking a simple breakfast, checking his gear, scanning the small screen on the wall for news from the city above. But Saraya noticed the way his eyes lingered on Leary when she laughed. It was almost as if the sound reminded him of something long lost. Later, when Daniel went out to get more supplies, Saraya risked peeking through the narrow wall slit again. She saw him take a different path this time, heading toward the lower black market district. The area was infamous for danger, a place where desperate souls and ruthless traders met. She followed him at a distance, keeping to the shadows. Through the haze of smoke and noise, she saw him bargaining with a merchant over something small wrapped in cloth. When the deal was done, he tucked it into his jacket and left without looking. Back, Saraya returned to the shelter before him, her mind racing. Why would he risk the black market for something so small? What was he hiding? When he returned, she tried to read his face, but it was unreadable. He placed the bundle on the shelf without explanation. Saraya didn't ask, not yet, but the mystery only deepened her curiosity. That night, as Leary slept, Saraya sat by the heating lamp, watching Daniel work on repairing the small drone. Finally she spoke, her voice careful. "You've lost people," she said. Not as a question but as a truth. Daniel froze for just a second, then gave a small nod. "So have I," she added quietly. For the first time since she met him, his eyes softened in a way that was almost vulnerable. Neither of them said more, but in that silent moment, something shifted. It wasn't trust yet, not fully, but it was the start of understanding. Two people, both carrying ghosts, finding themselves in the same fragile shelter against a world that had abandoned them. The days passed quietly, but the silence was an illusion. Outside Daniel's small shelter, the city was always alive with noise, traders shouting prices, machines grinding, and voices whispering in the shadows. Saraya could feel it, the way people in the market stared when Daniel walked past, the way some conversations stopped when he entered. At first, she thought it was because he was human, an uncommon sight in this part of the city. But soon, she realized it was something more. One morning, Daniel returned from the market earlier than usual, his jaw tight. He dropped a bag of food on the table without speaking. Saraya noticed the slight bruise forming on his cheek. "What happened?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he said flatly, avoiding her gaze. But she could tell someone had confronted him. And it wasn't just a random fight. Later that day, while Daniel repaired a broken heating pipe outside, Saraya overheard two alien merchants passing by. "Foolish human," one hissed, "sheltering an outcast widow. Asking for trouble. His kind are reckless." The other replied, "Sooner or later, the patrols will notice, and they will both disappear." Their voices faded, but the words stayed with her. Saraya's chest tightened. She had been cast out before. She had been whispered about before, but now those whispers were about him too. That evening, she decided to leave. She waited until Daniel stepped into the back corner to check the water filter, then quietly wrapped her daughter in the blanket. If they left now, maybe she could slip away without bringing him more trouble. She moved toward the door, her hand on the latch, but before she could open it, Daniel's voice stopped her. "Going somewhere?" She froze. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You've done enough for me," she said without turning. "I won't let your life be ruined because of me." Daniel stepped closer, his boots soft against the floor. "You think I care what they say out there?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Saraya turned to face him, her eyes flashing. "Yes, because words turn into actions, and soon they'll come for you." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I've already lost too much," he said quietly. "Don't make me lose you too." The words struck her harder than she expected. No one had ever said that to her, not since before her husband died. She lowered her eyes, unable to speak, and Daniel simply moved past her to bolt the door. As if the matter was settled, the next day, the market was tense. Daniel took Soraya and Leary with him, thinking it might be safer to keep them close. But as they moved through the narrow streets, Soraya noticed eyes following them. At a fruit stall, the merchant's smile was thin, his voice clipped. "Prices are higher for you today," he said to Daniel. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he paid without argument. At the next stall, they were refused entirely, the owner waving them away. By the time they reached the far end of the market, the whispers had grown louder. Some called her cursed. Others said she was dangerous. And a few muttered that humans who kept company with her would meet the same fate as her husband. On the way back, Soraya kept glancing over her shoulder. She thought she saw the same cloaked figure in the crowd more than once, but whenever she looked directly, he was gone. Daniel noticed her unease but didn't ask. His hand stayed near the weapon at his side, his eyes scanning every corner. When they reached the shelter, Daniel locked the door and set down the supplies. "They're watching us," Soraya said, her voice low. "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why you don't leave alone." Her frustration flared. "You can't protect us forever." His answer was steady. "Watch me." That night, as Leary slept, the two of them sat by the dim heating lamp. Daniel was sharpening a blade, the steady scrape filling the silence. "You're risking everything for me," Soraya said finally. Daniel's eyes stayed on the blade. "Maybe I'm not the only one risking something." She didn't know what to say. Because he was right, staying here was a risk for her too. But leaving felt even more dangerous now. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the sound of voices from the street below. The words were faint, but one sentence reached her clearly. "Tomorrow night, we take the human first, then the widow." Soraya's blood ran cold. She looked at Daniel, wondering if she should tell him, but before she could speak, he glanced up, as if he already knew. "Get some rest," he said, sliding the blade back into its sheath. "We might have a long night ahead." The night was too quiet. Even the usual hum of distant machinery seemed muffled, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Soraya sat awake beside her sleeping daughter, the blanket pulled high around them. Daniel was near the door, checking his rifle and adjusting a strap on his chest. His movements slow and deliberate. He hadn't said much since they returned from the market, but his eyes told her everything. He was expecting trouble. Hours passed, the dim glow of the heating lamp casting long shadows on the metal walls. Soraya's ears caught faint sounds outside, not footsteps, but the subtle scrape of something against the door. Daniel's head snapped up instantly, his hand lifting in a silent signal for her to stay still. The sound came again, followed by a soft metallic click. Someone was trying to unlock the door. In one motion, Daniel cut the heating lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Only the faint blue light from the window slit illuminated his face, his expression cold and focused. He moved silently to the side of the door, weapon raised. Soraya's heart pounded. She wrapped her arms protectively around Leary, who stirred in her sleep. Unaware of the danger creeping closer, the door slid open. A few inches, and a shadow slipped inside, followed by two more, masked figures in dark clothing, their eyes glinting in the low light. One of them hissed in an alien tongue, "Hand over the widow, and you can live." Daniel didn't answer. In the next second, he lunged forward, grabbing the nearest intruder by the collar and slamming him against the wall with bone-cracking force. The room erupted into chaos. The second intruder swung a blade, but Daniel blocked it with his rifle, twisting the weapon and striking back with the stock. Soraya froze for only a moment before instinct took over. She pulled a small, hidden device from under her sleeve, an old alien defense tool her husband had once given her. It had one charge left, but one was enough. The third intruder moved toward her, reaching for Leary. Soraya stepped in his path and pressed the device to his chest. A burst of electric light flashed, and the man screamed, collapsing to the floor, Her hands trembled, but she kept her body between the attacker and her child. Daniel had already taken down the first two. His breathing heavy but steady, one tried to crawl toward the door, but Daniel kicked it shut and stood over him. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The man spat in response, speaking in a dialect Saraya only half understood, something about orders and payment for returning her. Daniel's jaw tightened, and he hit the intruder's temple with the rifle butt, knocking him out cold. The shelter smelled of sweat, metal, and the faint sharpness of burnt air from Saraya's defense strike. Daniel scanned the room quickly, making sure none of the attackers had dropped a tracker. He crouched by one of the unconscious bodies and searched his pockets, pulling out a small communicator. A red light blinked on it, pulsing slowly. They were sending location signals, Daniel muttered, crushing the device under his boot. Saraya's chest was tight, her pulse still racing. "They'll come back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he replied. "That's why we're leaving tonight." She glanced at Leary, still asleep despite the fight. "Leave? Where?" she asked. "Somewhere they won't follow," he said. "Already gathering supplies from the shelves. The longer we stay, the more they'll send." Within minutes, Daniel had packed food, water, medical supplies, and weapons into a single bag. He tossed a smaller blanket to Saraya. "Wrap her up. Keep her quiet," he instructed. She obeyed without question, feeling the weight of urgency pressing down on them. Before they left, Daniel knelt by the unconscious attackers. He bound their hands with a length of cord and tied them to the heating unit's frame. "They'll wake up, but not soon," he said, pulling his hood over his head. The streets outside were dark, lit only by scattered street lamps flickering. In the mist, Daniel led the way, keeping to the narrow back alleys, his rifle slung across his chest. Saraya followed closely, carrying Leary against her shoulder, the child's warm breath steady against her neck. As they moved, Saraya whispered, "Why risk yourself for me? You could have let them take me and been safe." Daniel didn't slow his pace. "You think they would have left me alive after that?" he said, his voice low. "No, we're in this together now." They reached the far end of the district. Just as a distant siren wailed, Daniel glanced back toward the market streets, his eyes narrowing. "They'll find the shelter soon," he said. "But by then, we'll be gone." They slipped into an old, unused maintenance tunnel, the air damp and cold. The sound of the city above faded, replaced by the drip of water and the echo of their footsteps. For the first time in hours, Saraya let out a shaky breath. But she knew this wasn't over. If anything, the attack had only made one thing clear: whoever wanted her wasn't going to stop. And Daniel, whether he liked it or not, had just made himself her only shield. Asterisk. The maintenance tunnel stretched on for what felt like miles, its damp walls glistening under the faint beam of Daniel's small flashlight. Saraya followed close behind, holding Leary tightly, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly in the cold air. Every so often, Daniel would stop and listen, his sharp senses checking for anyone following, but the tunnel remained empty except for the distant drip of water. After nearly an hour of walking, they emerged into a wider chamber, where rusted doors lined the walls. Daniel scanned the markings on each one until he found a hatch with faded human writing scratched above it. "This will do," he murmured, kneeling to pry it open. With a loud creak, the hatch gave way, revealing a narrow stairway leading up into darkness. They climbed carefully, Leary half asleep in Saraya's arms, until they stepped into a small, abandoned outpost. It was dusty and cold, but the walls were solid, and the thick metal door had a locking mechanism still intact. Daniel quickly checked the perimeter, his boots leaving faint prints in the dust. "No one's been here in years," he said. "That's good for us." Saraya set Leary down on an old cot, pulling the blanket tighter around her. The child stirred but didn't wake, her small face peaceful for once. Saraya straightened and looked around the place. Broken furniture, Shelves of empty crates. A dead heating unit in the corner. "This is home now?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "For a while," Daniel replied. "Already moving to repair the heater. We just need to make it livable." They worked in silence for hours. Daniel fixing the unit while Soraya cleared space and found anything that could be used as bedding. When the heater finally hummed to life, the room filled with a soft wave of warmth, Soraya sank onto the cot beside Leary, letting the heat sink into her tired body. "You've done this before," she said, watching Daniel adjust the heater's settings. "Done what?" he asked without looking up. "Made a home out of nothing," she replied. He paused for a moment before answering. "When you've been on the run long enough, you learn." Later, Daniel cooked a simple meal from the supplies he had carried. They sat together on the floor, eating in quiet companionship, the soft crackle of the heater filling the silence. It was strange, Soraya thought, how quickly danger could turn strangers into something more. Not friends. Not yet. But no longer strangers either. When they finished eating, Soraya leaned back against the wall, her eyes half closed. She could feel Daniel's gaze on her, not sharp or questioning, but as if he was measuring her strength. "You could have left me in the streets that night," she said softly. "Why didn't you?" Daniel set his empty cup aside, his expression unreadable. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind," he said quietly. The words sank into her like a slow, deep ache. She thought of the day her husband's family had turned her away. The cold looks, the final slam of the door, and here was a man from another world, another life, who understood that kind of abandonment without her having to explain. In the days that followed, they settled into a quiet rhythm. Daniel would leave at dawn to scout the surrounding areas and gather supplies. Always returning before nightfall, Soraya kept the outpost clean, prepared meals, and cared for Leary. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they worked side by side in silence. But each day, the space between them grew smaller. One afternoon, while Daniel was repairing a section of the outer wall, Soraya sat nearby mending a torn blanket. The sunlight filtering through the cracks caught in his hair, and for the first time she noticed how tired he truly looked, not just physically, but in a way that came from carrying too many burdens for too long. "You're not just helping me," she said quietly. "You're surviving too." He looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them. "Maybe we're both doing a little of both," he replied. That night after Leary had fallen asleep, they sat by the heater. Daniel poured 2 cups of hot tea from the small kettle, handing one to her. For a long while, they didn't speak, letting the quiet warmth wrap around them. Finally, Soraya said, "No one has given me warmth in a long time. Not just the kind from a fire, but the kind that makes you feel safe." Daniel didn't answer right away, but his eyes softened. "Sometimes warmth is all we really need," he said. For Soraya, it was the first time in years she had chosen to stay somewhere, not because she had no choice, but because she wanted to. And as the night deepened, she realized that leaving this place, leaving him, was a thought she no longer wanted to entertain. The days in the abandoned outpost began to blur together. The heater's soft hum, the sound of Daniel's boots on the floor, and the quiet laughter of Leary became the rhythm of their lives. For the first time in years, Soraya felt something she had almost forgotten. Peace. It wasn't perfect, and danger still lurked beyond the walls, but inside, there was warmth, food, and the company of someone who didn't look at her like she was cursed. But peace, she knew, never lasted long in a place like this. One cold evening, while Daniel was checking the outer perimeter, Soraya caught movement through a crack in the wall. Shadows too many to be animals. Her heart skipped, and she called out, "Daniel." He returned quickly, rifle already in hand. "What is it?" "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight, through the slit in the door. They saw a small group of alien patrol soldiers making their way toward the outpost. Their armor caught the dying sunlight, their weapons ready. Daniel's expression hardened. "They found us," he muttered. Saraya's stomach knotted. "What do they want?" "You," Daniel replied without hesitation. "And if they can't have you, they'll take me too." Leary stirred in her blanket. Sensing the tension, Daniel crouched beside her. His voice calm despite the urgency in his eyes. "Stay close. To your mother, no matter what happens." Then he rose, loading his rifle with smooth, practiced movements. The soldiers stopped a short distance from the outpost. One of them stepped forward, his voice echoing in the still air. "Human, hand over the widow and her child, and we will let you live." Daniel didn't even flinch. "Not happening," he called back, his tone sharp as steel. The alien's reply was a cold laugh. "You would risk death for an outcast?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "I would risk more than that." The first shot came from the soldiers, a searing bolt that hit the outer wall, showering sparks. Daniel moved fast, pulling Saraya and Leary behind a reinforced section of the room. "Stay low," he ordered, then leaned out to return fire. His shots were precise, forcing the soldiers to take cover. Saraya's pulse raced. She wasn't a soldier, but she couldn't just sit and watch, grabbing the old alien defense device. She waited for a soldier to get too close. When one tried to flank the door, she stepped out and pressed the charge against his armor, the burst of electricity sending him crashing to the ground. Daniel glanced back briefly, a flicker of approval in his eyes, before refocusing on the fight. The battle didn't last long. The sound of weapons drew attention from the nearby settlement, and soon figures appeared on the horizon, not soldiers, but armed civilians. Some were human survivors. Others were aliens who had grown tired of the patrol's cruelty. They surrounded the soldiers, forcing them to retreat. The leader of the group, an older human man, stepped forward. "We heard what they were planning," he said. "No one takes our own, not anymore." Surya stood in stunned silence. She had expected the world to turn its back on her, as it always had. But now, strangers had stepped forward to protect them. That night, the outpost was filled with quiet celebration. The civilians shared food and supplies, promising to keep watch for any signs of returning patrols. For the first time in a long while, Saraya felt safe, not just because of the walls or the heater, but because of the people around her. Later, when the others had gone and the outpost was quiet again, Saraya sat beside Daniel near the heater. Leary was curled up between them, fast asleep. Saraya looked at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice soft. "No home wanted a widow like me. But you gave me more than a home. You gave me warmth." Daniel's eyes met hers, steady and warm in the glow of the fire. "Maybe that's all a home really is," he said. "A place where you're not alone." They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that didn't need words. Outside, the wind rattled the old metal walls. But inside, the air was steady and warm. Saraya knew that danger would come again one day, but when it did, they would face it together. This was no longer just a shelter. It was theirs, and for the first time in her life since losing everything, Saraya didn't feel like a burden or an outcast. She felt like she belonged.